there is hypocrisy and then there is European hypocrisy. Why do we say that? Consider this. European Union countries have increased their imports of liquefied natural gas or LNG from Russia compared with before the Ukraine war. Why is this significant? It's because the European Union had claimed that it was going to quit Russian fossil fuels within a few years, reduce its dependence on Russian oil and essentially distance itself from Russia to ensure the country does not profit from its oil sales to Europe and fatten its war chest. And that would be a fitting punishment following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Well, clearly, Europe is in no mood to walk the talk. Let's look at the figures in some detail. In the first 7 months of 2023, EU countries imported 40% more Russian LNG on tankers than during the same period in 2021, the year before Russia invaded Ukraine. This is according to campaign group Global Witness. This essentially means EU countries imported 22 million cubic meters of Russian LNG between January and July this year. Spain is now the second largest buyer of Russian LNG worldwide, with Belgium close behind. During the first 7 months of 2023, Spain took 18% of Russia's total sales, while Belgium took in 17%. In fact, Belgium and Spain nearly doubled their imports of Russian LNG in the first 12 months since Russia invaded Ukraine. And Russia made up around 16% of the European Union's total LNG imports during this period. That would be equivalent to 13 billion cubic meters of natural gas. Data from the EU Commission also shows that the European Union countries imported 62 billion cubic meters of pipeline gas from Russia in 2022. But the uptick in LNG runs counter to the EU's aim to end its reliance on Russian fossil fuels by 2027. Global Witness estimates that EU countries' Russian natural gas purchases this year so far to be worth a whopping 5.3 billion euros. That's almost $5.8 billion. Global Witness campaigner Jonathan Rona-Gant says buying Russian gas has the same impact as buying Russian oil. Both fund the war in Ukraine. While the 27-country European Union has sanctioned Russian coal and seaborne oil imports, Russian natural gas is not subject to EU sanctions. Analysts at CapraView, a global gas forecasting firm, estimate that almost half of the LNG Russia exported in the first 10 months after its invasion of Ukraine flowed to Europe, representing approximately $14 billion in revenue. Now, this reeks of hypocrisy at multiple levels. Why? Because when India, which of course has friendly ties with Russia, decided to increase its Russian oil imports last year on the grounds that oil from there was available at discounted prices and the Indian government had to place the interests of the Indian people above other considerations, there was a massive furor and self-righteous condemnation, criticism and lecturing that New Delhi was gratuitously subjected to. At the India-US 2+2 ministerial dialogue in Washington in April 2022, for instance, India's External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar was asked by sanctimonious Western journalists about India's Russian oil purchases in the wake of the Ukraine war. Jaishankar cut them down to size when he replied, and I quote, "If you are looking at energy purchases from Russia, I would suggest that your attention should be focused on Europe. Yes, we do buy some energy which is necessary for our energy security, but I suspect, looking at the figures, probably our total purchases for an entire month would be less than what Europe buys in an afternoon." In May this year, in response to EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell's comments urging action against Indian refined products derived from Russian crude, Jaishankar suggested that Borrell should examine the regulations of the European Union Council. He said, look at EU Council regulations. Russian crude is substantially transformed in a third country and then no longer treated as Russian. Now, that you would agree is the height of Western hypocrisy. All right. We still have Shri with us from Washington, D.C. At this point, we're also joined by former Indian diplomat, Ambassador R.P. Kaushik. Ambassador Kaushik, let me start with you. You know, the latest figures that have come out seem to clearly suggest that not only has Europe not kept its promise of reducing its dependence on Russian energy, their energy imports from that country have in fact doubled since the Ukraine war began. Now, if you compare this with the kind of sanctimonious lectures that New Delhi received from the West, especially its media last year in the wake of the war, what else would you call it but hypocrisy?
No, Madam Neha, you have analyzed the situation briefly, very well. And I can only add on that Europe's dependence on Russian oil, as well as to a certain extent the gas, to keep the country warm, extraordinarily, very much dependent. And it's unfortunate that despite all the promises and all the pleas that they have been advancing against Russia in the Ukraine war, unfortunately, they cannot possibly draw on completely on the United States, nor can they draw on the West Asia, because that also is shrinking considerably, and the nearest position being what it is in Russia. Therefore, I would imagine that as far as India is concerned, the position that we took earlier was quite all right. Beyond that, we cannot perhaps stress the argument to a great extent, because in diplomacy there is no such thing as hypocrisy, there is no such thing as secrecy, there is no such thing as openness, because everything is included. It's all inclusive. We all do that, and the Russians are no exception to it. And the others will not be any exception to it either. For instance, the European countries will largely depend on Russia for the supply of this, and on a much cheaper rate as compared to the kind of dependence on certain other areas of the globe. So I'm not surprised at all that this is taking place. This was in fact anticipated to some extent. People did hope that this will break down. Even Putin knew that it will not last for too long, and they will have some kind of a schism or some kind of breakdown in the cohesion of this nature. So I think it is quite all right, quite acceptable in the diplomatic circles to the extent I can understand.
Right. Shri, let me come to you at this point. You know, if there is one area that India has asserted its strategic autonomy in, undoubtedly, it has been with regard to Russia ever since this war began. Whether it was, you know, vis-a-vis refusing to condemn Russia for its invasion, taking what has been described by some as a neutral stance, or whether it is with respect to increasing our Russian oil imports. India has made it abundantly clear that the interests of the Indian people come first, and we are not going to be lectured to. And it's interesting what our External Affairs Minister told some self-righteous Western journalists last year, that what India buys in an entire month from Russia is probably what Europe buys in an afternoon. Now look at these figures, the latest data that has just come out. This substantiates Dr. Jaishankar's claims, and how?
Absolutely, Neha. So, Neha, when India was getting excoriated by international media for beginning to buy Russian oil, that was a time when for the last 3 years, we hadn't bought even a barrel of oil from Iran, which had always been one of our key suppliers of crude oil. So the question is, and then at that point, Europe told us, oh, look at India, you guys are buying oil, it's going to fund Putin's war, you have blood on your hands. And what was, Europe saying at that time? Look at us, we're going to stop buying the coal from, Russia, we're going to stop buying oil from Russia, and we're going to turn off our, pipelines, which get us gas and oil from Russia. But what has turned out to be the reality? Well, they have been welcoming with open arms the ships that have been coming into European ports laden with Russian gas. In fact, more than half of Russia's exports of gas this year, so far this year, Neha, has been to these countries. And as you mentioned, these countries, some of these countries have spent more than 5 billion euros buying these, gas shipments from Russia. So Europe should first of all get off its high horse, its high moral horse, when it lectures India. I think that's the first thing. Ambassador Kaushik mentioned that in diplomacy, and there is nothing like hypocrisy and all that. Fine, so let them admit it. Let them say that, yeah, we were wrong. So you have to understand, so why are they now being secretly buying Russian gas? It boils down to one thing: price. Because when you put Russia out of the gas market, prices shot up. It went up to 600% of what they were used to paying. And now with winter approaching, Europe needs gas to keep its homes warm. But let's also ask the question, was Europe in a very desperate situation where there were no suppliers of gas and therefore it had to stock up? No, US is a big supplier, Qatar is a big supplier, Australia is a big supplier of LNG. Or was it the case that Europe's own gas supply was hitting perilously low levels and therefore they had no choice but to buy from Russia to stock up their gas levels? Absolutely not. Again, compared to 2021-22, they have 21% more gas stock than they had before. So there's absolutely no problem in terms of the supply or in terms of their own stock levels. They have simply gone back to buying Russian gas because it makes sense, economic sense. Then for European nations to excoriate India and say that please don't buy Russian oil, and that's utter nonsense. India is a growing country. We import 85% of our energy needs. We have to cater to 1.4 billion people, many of whom are poor, and inflation takes a direct hit when fuel prices go up. So I think what Indian government has done is probably the best thing one could have done as a country. And so I salute, Prime Minister Modi and our Foreign Minister Jaishankar for taking their hard line and saying that this is what we will do in our interest, because ultimately the Prime Minister Modi, Minister Jaishankar, they're responsible to the people of India who have voted them into power. And, if Europe, being a rich nation, cannot afford to buy, expensive gas, then certainly India as a poor country cannot absolutely afford to, go broke buying crude from Russia or any other country, Neha. That's as simple as that. So now Europe owes an explanation. Whose hands are bloodied now? Whose hands are awash in blood of Ukraine victims?
Who's fattening? Yes, who's fattening Putin's war chest now? Who's funding the Ukraine war now? India or them?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
Well, this is fascinating, really. The message really seems to be, if we do it, it is pragmatism, it is self-interest. But if you do it, if India does it, good Lord, it is a crime. You have blood on your hands. And with due apologies to the ambassador, I would still say this does reek of hypocrisy. Ambassador, I want to cite another example to you. In May this year, the European Union Foreign Policy Chief, Josep Borrell, actually went as far as to say that action should be initiated against Indian refined products that are derived from Russian crude oil. Do you know what our External Affairs Minister told Borrell? He said, look at your EU Council regulations. What you do is, Russian crude is substantially transformed in a third country and then you stop calling it Russian anymore. Now, if there was ever an instance of duplicity, sir, this is it.
No, I'm very happy that you have defined it very well. Only thing is that semantics do not define the verbosity in diplomacy. One way or the other, you can mix it up. The Chinese have been doing for a very long time. The Russians are doing. Others are doing. I'm being a little realistic on this issue, and I would imagine that I don't think this kind of cohesion will work for too long. I think the Europe is going to fall back again on Russian oil, on Russian gas, and certain other kind of things which are taking place there. That's all I would say. Thank you.
All right, Shri, I will give you the last word as we wrap up this discussion. Do you agree with the ambassador that, for all the big claims that Europe has made about reducing their dependence on Russian fossil fuels by 2027, finding other means of meeting their energy security, it looks like their imports of energy from Russia are only going to go up. Do you see it panning out that way?
Absolutely, Neha, because, for a country to grow, it needs energy. That's the harsh reality. You cannot wish that fact away. You have to fuel your factories, you have to fuel your cars, you have to fuel your homes. So there is absolutely no way to escape that reality. So what happens when you take one supply out of the market? The price automatically goes up. Unless the demand also corrects sharply, the prices will go up. That's simple economic logic. It's no rocket science. So, if we talk about how Spain and Belgium, all these countries are like importing gas, but that's actually being re-exported within EU. It's like people like Germany, which are actually buying all this. It's only a transition. It's only a transit point for the gas. The beneficiaries of Russian gas is actually the larger EU economies, which have a greater need. So let us not, diss a country like India for doing what is in its interest, while you yourself very secretly are purchasing Russian gas to meet your own requirements, because that is a hard reality. So please don't pontificate and don't lecture a country like India. That's all I humbly request the European, our friends in European Union.
And on that note, Shri, I'd like to leave our viewers with this one fact and one interesting thought, which is this, that in the first 10 months after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Russia exported energy to Europe that actually represented approximately $14 billion in revenue. Therefore, the European Union does need to ask itself who is actually funding the Ukraine war, if that is the high moral ground that they choose to take vis-a-vis countries like India. On that note, Shri, as always, a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for joining us from DC. And Ambassador Kaushik, sir, thank you for your time and perspective as well.